Well, hello everyone. Welcome to session number 3. Some of you, I can see, have been here all day, which is really exciting. We want to thank you because it's our inaugural Stella Day Out, our first ever all-day free talk fest with our Stella Prize winning authors. I'd like to acknowledge the lands on which we are talking today and pay my respects to elders past and present and emerging, and recognise that sovereignty was never ceded. Thank you so much for coming to this session, which is called the Stella Prize Story. And I'm joined today by, from your left, Monica Dux, Jo Case and Christine Gordon. So Monica Dux is the author of 2 memoirs, Lapsed, Losing Your Religion is Harder Than It Looks, and Things I Didn't Expect When I Was Expecting. She's the co-author of The Great Feminist Denial and editor of the anthology Metamorphosis. Monica was a founding board member of the Stella Prize and the Feminist Writers Festival. From 2013 until 2022, she was a columnist for the Saturday Age. She's currently working on a 3rd memoir and doing a PhD in creative practice at RMIT. Welcome, Monica. Jo Case is an Adelaide-based writer, editor and critic who is deputy editor of the Books and Ideas of the Conversation. She's been associate publisher at Wakefield Press, deputy editor of the Australian Book Review, books editor of The Big Issue, and associate editor of Kill Your Darlings. A former programming manager of Melbourne Writers Festival, Jo was a co-founder of the Feminist Writers Festival and a founding board member of the Stella Prize. She's the author of the memoir Boomer and Me and co-editor with Clem Bastow, a forthcoming anthology of essays by autistic women and gender diverse writers at the University of Queensland Press. Her personal essays have been published in the anthologies Metamorphosis and Rebellious Daughters. Her cultural criticism has been published in The Age, Sydney Morning Herald, The Guardian, Australian Book Review and The Monthly, and she writes a monthly books column for Adelaide's In Review. Thank you, Jo. Very impressive. Christine Gordon is the Programming and Community Engagement Manager for Readings, a role she has held for many years. Prior to realising her role of dreams, Christine worked for many years in women's public health. I did. She's one of the founding board members of the Stella Prize, sits on the board of the Emerging Writers Festival, the Victorian Women's Trust and Readings Foundation. She's been the recipient of 2 City of Literature International Travel Grants, and in 2020, she completed a Women in Leadership certificate. Apart from a lifelong devotion to feminism, Christine is, of course, an avid reader, and I've just discovered a gardener. It's true. So I'll sit down now. So today we're going to talk about the history of Stella because as the new CEO, I've been in the role for 6.5 months. I was quite aware of the importance of Stella on the landscape, and I was quite aware that as a feminist organisation and an arts organisation, those 2 important strands of Stella need to be explained, I think, in more detail, particularly for me, and I'm sure for the audience, you're going to be quite excited to hear more about the evolution of the Stella or the Stella Prize. So it started in 2012 after a panel that was held at Readings on International Women's Day. The panel discussed the underrepresentation of women on the literary pages of Australian newspapers and the underrepresentation of women as winners of literary prizes. Afterwards, a group of women, 3 of whom sit with me now, decide to meet to work out how to make a change. So my first question is to you, Jo, just to get you to perhaps give us a little bit of detail about that first meeting at Readings and anything else you'd like to share with us.
Okay, thanks, Fiona. It's interesting. We've all talked about like having to really dig deep into our memories to remember exactly how things unfolded. But we had an event at Readings, which Chris was the events manager there. So organised with Chris. I was at the time associate editor of Kill Your Darlings with Rebecca Stafford, and who was the editor, and Rebecca and Hannah Kent, who was also another editor at Kill Your Darlings, and I wanted to do an event for International Women's Day. And Chris at Readings also wanted to do an event for International Women's Day. So we had a chat and decided to put something on. Monica had written a terrific essay for issue 2 of Kill Your Darlings about the female eunuch by Germaine Greer. So we brought her on board as a panellist. Sophie Cunningham was about to write an essay for Kill Your Darlings about underrepresentation of women in literature, and she'd collected all of these fantastic stats. There'd also just been the VIDA count, was it?
Yeah, that was the year before, had come out in the US.
Yeah, which was showing how much women were underrepresented in the literary pages internationally. And so Sophie was using that as part of her essay and brought that along to the conversation. There was also Louise Swin, who was a publisher at Sleepers. So I think that was the panel. And
There was a man, wasn't there?
sorry?
Was there a man?
There was not a man at that first.
No,
we
I thought there was
remember
one
no man.
I remember a man, some panel with a man.
There were later panels with men.
We talk about men, though.
Yeah.
We were talking about men and about how they like to talk
When I was trying to
about men.
remember, I thought there was some man. Yeah, it must have been another one. There was a man.
Yeah, later on we used
He was a nice man. That's why I was thinking. Yeah, it was a
Well,
nice man. Yeah, he was. He
You
was.
were in a
Chris
relationship
Flynn?
with a nice man, was
Yeah.
that he?
No, that wasn't him. But
Oh,
he was. No, it was a nice. Anyway, sorry. We digress.
there were nice men with further events, but at this
Yeah.
event there were no men.
There were no
nice
men.
or otherwise. So we had this great discussion, and at the end of it, I think we all went out for drinks afterwards, and Sophie Cunningham emailed us all a couple of days later and said, let's get to. I'm really fired up. Let's get together and talk about actually doing something about this instead of just always talking about it. So we all agreed. We were all, excited to do that. We met at, I'm going to throw to you in a sec, Chris. We met at Markov Bar in Carlton, and on the day that we were meeting, the Miles Franklin shortlist was announced, and it was the second one. It was the second year in a row that there were no women on the shortlist. So that became part of our discussion, and Chris is going to take this up in a moment. But I did find a quote from the chair of judges for that year. I won't say her name because I don't want to pick on anyone, but I'll just say the chair of judges for the Miles Franklin told The Age, you read the text and you don't worry about who wrote the book. If the book stays with you, if it seems to be great literature or approaching that status, then it will get the nod. And I just think it's so interesting because we've moved on quite away from that kind of view, just being like, it doesn't matter who wrote the book. And we were part of that. So, yeah. Chris, do you want to take it up?
Should I sort of take it up about how on the second glass of wine we started talking about how cross we were,
Yep.
and just sort of say to everyone that's here that's ever felt a little bit shitty with a situation, who's ever thought that they have been part of some sort of misdemeanor, some sort of misunderstanding about the way the world works. Well, that's how we were like. We felt a bit miffed, and a bit cross, and we actually decided to do something with that shittiness, and that was to start the Women's Prize. And I just want to sort of assure you that anger at times, fury, in the most appropriate use of it, can actually change lives for the better. We didn't go out there screaming. We decided instead to work together and to do something with this internal burning anger that we felt towards the misrepresentation of women in the literary scene.
So with that discussion, I suppose, I mean, there's one thing to discuss, and the other, I suppose, there's a huge step between discussion and realisation. So I'm just wondering if, Monica, if you want to talk about how you ended up as a group, I suppose, in the first instance, choosing the name Stella, and how you ended up garnering the support to actually end up with a prize that's now in its 12th year with, $60,000 worth of cash for its first prize. I mean, it's a pretty big accomplishment.
Mm.
I know that there was anger, and I know that you wanted to work collectively, but
There was no sex.
how were those steps?
No sex. No, I was saying to Joe earlier when we were trying to remember, it's all a blank. It was a big jump. But, okay, picking up on Chris's, this idea of anger, I think it was a really good moment because I think there were sort of two things that the Stella did, or we did. The Stella was born in this anger. One thing was it was a bit of a no-brainer, the issue. And I think with feminist issues and all sorts of social justice issues, it's sometimes really hard to communicate the complexity of something. Patriarchy is complex. Injustice is often complex and there's a lot of nuance. This one wasn't. It was basically, I mean, as far as I saw it, like you're saying with the Miles Franklin, the not unnamed commentator there, it was like either you accept that men are just better at writing books or there's something that's going wrong.
Yeah.
And I think we sort of had them. I think there was a real sense early on, and I think we all felt that it really, you couldn't argue with it.
It was the second year in a row, wasn't it?
Yeah.
An all-male.
And it wasn't just, of course, the Miles.
Franklin.
Yeah, and it wasn't just the Miles Franklin that was in the review pages, and there was statistics, the Vita statistics coming out of the US. And so it's like we had people cornered where they either had to say men are just better writers, which they weren't going to say. At least publicly.
Some people did.
Some people
did
back
then.
then.
Yeah.
They wanted to say that.
They did want to say.
Yeah, or they were going to say, well, there's something wrong. There's something wrong that got us to this point. So I think in terms of our momentum, that we all just thought this is, there. But I think another reason initially we got it off the ground and it got this, it accelerated, is also that the nature of, activism. Like it was a very activist project, but it was also very targeted. And the best sort of activism is targeted. And I think Stella had this wonderful thing of, on the one hand, you can't argue with that. And on the other hand, we're going to look at this in a really specific way. And it has grown. I mean, in, over a decade, it's expanded and it's done so much great work in lots of other ways. I think because we set out saying, let's just see if we can get a prize up. And that's one thing, but we want to make it big. Like we were all very clear that it wasn't going to be a small prize, that we wanted to go for the big money. And I think that's why it's sort of that momentum stayed. And so we were all sort of invigorated by that, I think.
Yeah. And looking through, I found some old meeting minutes on my computer this week. I was like, great.
I was so impressed.
I remembered that because I have this feeling of, oh, thank God Joe's doing it.
Really, I can't remember just getting the cheese and the wine and meeting there in that reading boardroom.
And Chris actually also did something that was integral, sounds small, but was integral. Getting when you're asking how did you actually go from talking about this to making it a thing, first thing was where are we going to meet? And you talked to Mark about, providing the readings wardrobe. There was also
Mark is the owner of Readings.
Sorry, yeah.
Yeah, just for those that don't know. And actually he gave us the first amount of money to get it going.
That's right.
Out of his own pocket.
And
I think basically just to whatever, Chris, just stop talking.
Well, also when I was looking back, you talked to Mark for advice about how we set up a company. Yeah. You talked to Mark about how, and to the Readings accountants for advice about how to get our donations and, all of these nitty gritty, boring little things that had to be done. I think a lot of that was building it, you do the first step, then you do the next step, and also asking people who. So many people contributed. There's so much in those minutes that I looked back that was we're asking these people for this advice and these people for this advice, and it all came together. But I have to say that looking back at it, Readings and Mark's advice was really integral at the beginning. So he was the man. There you go.
Yeah, he was the man.
And I suppose, I've got so many questions. I'll ask you more later, no doubt, but for the audience as well, I suppose prizes, there's many prizes in the art world. There's prizes where, you receive a camera if you're a photographer, but you've already got a camera,
Mm.
or you get a voucher, you know. So often the picture of a prize can be not as big and grand as it should be.
Mm.
And I suppose the thing that really impressed me about Stella and why I chose to join this organisation is that the amount of money that is given to the winner is significant. It's so significant that whenever I look at the quotes from all the past winners, they say it really did change their lives. It gave them, as Virginia Woolf said, not just a place, a time and a place to sit and do, but also the finances behind it. And I know that from the first winner who chose to share.
Oh. There she is.
Hi, Carrie.
Could you stand up? No.
Yes. Do you remember we were so excited when she won? We cried. We all cried. Do you remember that? And I remember seeing her kids, and she had a teenage son, and he went bright red when they called out her name, and was hugging his sister, and they were quite teary. It was I remember it very well.
Yes, we.
So
No.
It really is a chat. So I suppose maybe you, Jo, could just talk to me about, as a writer, the whole notion of why the Stella Prize has changed the literary landscape and how it's changed it.
Yeah.
Perhaps even more about why.
Okay. Well, I guess, in terms of that prize money, I should say right from the beginning, like we said it had to be $50,000. And, another interesting thing was looking back on how long it took over a year for us to build up to even the beginnings of really knowing that we were going to have that money or have any money. It took a long time, but we never compromised and went, this is how much we can get, so we're going to start with this. It was like you had to start with a bang. So sorry, I've gone slightly off track from that, haven't I? How it made a difference. I think we were, and in terms of that, like asking different people for input, I remember, so Monica talked to the Vita people in the US who'd been doing that important work of gathering stats on underrepresentation. I think, Chris, are you the one who spoke to the Orange Prize people?
I did. And one of them was coming out, and Louise, when I met with them, it was coming out on a book tour. Yeah. But we learned quite a lot from the Women's Prize in the UK because they too had a significant amount. And if you won the Women's Prize, it really was supposed to be a life-changing moment, and that made so much sense to us.
Yeah.
I think also that sense of what the Stella Prize set out to do, like I was just saying earlier about it, we were very targeted, and it is about one prize. Someone gets a lot of money, but actually it was a very big conversation in the world of literature, and that was actually what it was about. Like we had a little thing that was the beacon, but in a way the prize itself is the vehicle for a much bigger discussion, and one that's been evolving over the last 13 years or so, which is really interesting to me to think what our conversations back then and our understanding of what it was going to be and the parameters of what literature and women in literature, and that it's like it has actually evolved, and continually those conversations keep happening, and that's really exciting. It's not like this static, we set up a prize and it's for women, and it's like, no, it's actually about representation and diversity and all these other things, and it's an ongoing debate. And so so I think the prize itself is the light. Everything else is all the stuff that gets shone, hopefully.
And that's why I was that's why I was so pleased to find that little quote that was from the Miles Franklin about representation not being important, and to think about how far we've evolved in that conversation. I think one important thing was that it was always, for all of us, I think, not just about the prize, but why we were doing it at every step. And I feel like obviously that was built into the core, and that's something that the Stella organisation has just continued to do. I think when we started, we were talking about, like, it was so dire, just representation of women. We weren't talking about diversity really at all. And it feels like we made real progress with representation of women. It was like, well, what's next, obviously, and diversity, diverse representation, and then bringing in non-binary writers as well. All of that has obviously built over the last decade, and it's so great to see. I feel like that's a huge part of the way that Stella has changed the conversation, is just been in making representation, or helping to make representation, an important conversation that needs to keep being had.
I suppose that's my next question, which is about the count, because it started with you as the founders, and the count, for people who don't know, is a qualitative and quantitative research project that started 12 years ago, which looked initially, because initially 12 years ago, it really was print media that was the major media that was reporting on literature, and it was about looking at how many column centimetres a woman who was a writer was getting, how many reviews, women versus men. It was men versus women was basically the narrative. The type of reviewer, the type of newspaper, the length of the review, and of course the frequency. So that's what I inherited when I started this year, and we're now looking, of course, at intersectionality, and we're moving across not just into the print media, which we know is sadly slowing down, but also looking at social media, so non-journalistic narratives within the social media, so picking up on influencers, I'm just trying to think of that word, influencers, and so that's the next stage. So I suppose what I'd love to know, maybe Christine, you could talk to me about why you decided so early on not just to look at prize money, not just to look at women writers, not just to look at all kinds of writing, because as we know, there's landscape writing prizes, and there's,
I didn't know that.
Sorry, there's all kind of specific prizes, and we've said pretty much non-fiction, fiction, poetry, memoir, biography, autobiography, poetry, graphic novel, like we're saying.
Pornography.
But pornography is accepted, actually.
It is.
But
if it's written by a woman, or
exactly.
someone who says that,
I know,
But,
I'm just being cheap. So.
But I suppose, coming back to the question, girls, so I have to write them in. The notion of the count was really not just about women winning prizes and individually becoming successful and growing women's literature. It was also, perhaps, I feel, and that's what I want to ask you about, was about actually saying, well, if we can do it in this landscape, which is literature, which is quite a small landscape, how can it inform and affect the broader community?
Well, it's a really excellent question. Thank you for asking it. It is a good one. So, when we talked before about some anger, and we talked about facts about why something like the Stella worked at that particular time, because it was factual based. Men were getting more attention than women writers. So we knew that we're going to have evidence all the way through. To have evidence is the easiest way of shutting people up. You go, okay, you know what, you can have your opinions, but here's the truth right here in front of us. It's in black and white. This is what we're dealing with. So we needed that evidence. We understood that we needed that evidence all the way through. So we were very encouraging of the count. We weren't dealing 12 years ago with book influencers and TikTok that you are now, those type of things, which I think is harder to count. But back then, it really was about the major papers, about the editors, the literary editors, both males, that were, had so much influence over the way that literature was read and discussed in this country. And we wanted to make sure that if you were at a dinner party, or if you were at a barbecue or whatever, and you said, hey, I've just read a book, a novel from the Stella shortlist, and someone asked you as a reader, why is that important? We wanted you to be able to have some evidence to back it up, not just the story itself, because that's how change happens, when all of you out there are working as our ambassadors. So that's how we felt we needed to set it up immediately. Also, we called it the Stella Prize. For those that don't know,
That was going to be my question.
Yeah, because Miles Franklin which is at that point it was one of the richest prizes. I think it was 40 grand or 45 grand that you won. It was actually a female, and her name was Stella. And she just wrote as a bloke's name because it was the only way to get published. So we were like, we're going to take back that name. And not only that, we're going to make sure our prize is worth more than the Miles Franklin. So that's how we got to that sum.
I was just going to interject the Chris, you saying about the strength of stats and that I was saying before that I had a moment early on when we were trying to get some noise about the prize before we had anything that we were, the making a lot of noise phase. And I must have been, I think it was on the book show or something for Radio National. They were interviewing us about it. And I went on with an editor of a major newspaper in Melbourne, an arts editor. And I could see it was like, because I think that maybe I put it, there was an opinion piece I'd written about stats, well, there was a lot of stats that week. And he sat outside the studio before and with his pages open, and I could see him counting how many women and men he'd had that weekend.
And I thought, sweaty?
Yeah, he looked scared. There was this fear. And I thought, you're trying to see, you're like, oh, but I've got, and I thought, yeah, we've got them. And I think that was the real sort of the drive, wasn't it? You can't, I mean, you can argue with statistics, of course, if you want to add some nuance, but at the time it was a real, so.
Can I just quickly add, I've found a few of the stats from that time, and I thought it might be interesting while we're, so an average of 30% of winners of the Premier's prizes around the country were women. Except for the WA Premier's Prize, which was the exception. 8 of the 14 winners, or the last 14 winners, had been women. The PM's Prize was too new, so that wasn't counted. The Miles Franklin at that time had been won by a woman only 13 of 50 times since it was set up, and only twice in the past decade.
And Thea Astley had already, and she won it a couple of times too.
Yeah. Several Australian state premiers literary awards had showed no women writers on the fiction shortlists the year before this. And then in terms of Australian publishing, although Australian publishing is mostly female, there was 62% then. Most senior positions were held by men, and 68% of the men in the industry earned $100,000 or more a year, but only 32% of the women in the industry earn that amount. So, yeah, that's what we were working from.
Stats. We love our stats, don't we?
Wow. But when I found them, I was like, oh, they're good. Or bad.
And it's different now. It's a different landscape.
Yeah, very
now.
different. Yeah.
Good job.
And if you were, on the board now or, working with us at Stella, where would you suggest the gaps are now? Joe?
Well,
yeah, Joe, you answer that, Joe. I'll get rid of the CEO for one. No, you're fantastic. Sorry, that's a joke.
I mean,
about a prize for men? What about the men?
Do you know, I have heard those arguments in the, obviously, but I mean, I think that obviously intersectionality is the next, it's what you're focusing on at the moment, but I think it's just really obvious that, and the fact that there's a diversity count now that that's being done, I think, out of VU. I remember they reported some stats last year. I think they're going to have an update coming up soon. And it's obvious that where the gaps are now are more in terms of having, different kinds of, different backgrounds, different kinds of authors who are represented, rather than just I think women are catching up. So, which is great. I can't remember what the most recent stats were, but they weren't like 30% and 70%. They were much more, in the 40 to 50%. We're kind of quibbling about 10% difference instead.
Oh, yeah, the count can't claim full responsibility for the change, the positive change that we've seen in women and non-binary literature.
No.
But it has got to about 52, and the decision we've made is to continue the count because people need to be held accountable. You can't just stop because it's going well, because it drops off the focus, of course.
Yeah.
But, we've done, as you know, and maybe many of the audience knows as well, we've done residency programs. We've had incredible incredibly generous women donors who have donated their weekenders, and then foundations primarily run by women. So we tend to be funded by organisations that are women run, which is so appropriate anyway.
Yeah.
So we've had, residency programs and funding so that people can have the money to take the time off. We ensure that all our authors are asked, for example, as well as being paid, we say travel, accommodation, pay, but also, do you need childcare?
Yeah.
So we try and sort of, I suppose, which is what it's grounded in where it was started, but we try and grow, we're trying to grow that area of what else can we do. That's what Stella Day Out is about. It's about, it's twofold. It's about giving more opportunities for Stella authors to discuss their books, for their books to be sold.
Yeah.
For media and PR to be that machinery to sort of talk about what they're doing. And equally importantly, it's also about celebrating the audiences and the people who read.
Yeah, which is, and I think, that was part, I remember that was really part of it right from the beginning too, was that it wasn't just a literary prize. It was about, obviously about, rewarding excellent writing, but it was also about changing and celebrating the way that people read, like the way people reading women writers. So, and that's something that I've just loved watching from afar, as is, I remember a publicist a couple of years ago telling me that the Stella Prize is the book prize now that sells, books, and that's great.
As a bookseller, if you see those sort of little stickers, that when you go into a bookshop and there's stickers there for the Miles Franklin or the Prime Minister, the Stella Prize, if you are on that shortlist, the increase can be up to 300%. Like, that's extraordinary, isn't it? For some titles, 300%.
I've seen on BookScan 800% a few years ago for other books. I think it might have been Heather Rose's book.
Yeah, for the museum.
So 800% spike in sales the week after it was announced.
Like, it can make a huge difference. So part of that is an understanding amongst the booksellers, we're always the sort of the first ones on the front ground saying, hey, to the librarians or the school teachers or the readers or the book groups, this is a book worth considering, and here's why. And one of the things that we wanted to do in the Stella Prize, and which has been really built on from those early days, is making sure that if you went onto that Stella site, you could get information about that woman, that author. You could get more than you needed that you might get elsewhere from just the back of the book, that there was always backup information. And I think that's really important, and I know that's something that the Stella Prize has continued to do, is that sort of work, make those authors accessible and make sure booksellers know about those authors, which is why those sort of book tours, bookshop tours are really important, because without those ambassadors, I know I've used that word before, then prizes don't work, and there's still a prize wouldn't work. Yeah,
because I suppose it comes back to ultimately the kind of income that an author can expect to earn. Of course, let's just assume they've got through all the hoops. The idea, the manuscript, the editor, the publisher, publishing it, the whole cycle.
And then they're lucky they make $10,000. They're so lucky.
I asked when I went to all the bookstores to see how many stickers I needed to give to each bookstore for the long list, short list, and the winner. They said we tend to buy between 3 and 5 books. Like 3 and 5 books. I was quite horrified because I didn't know anything about that whole side of the industry. So if there's 200 bookstores or 300 bookstores in Australia, which there are, and say they're buying 5 books.
There's a lot of pain, Fiona.
There's a lot of pain. You do a job both authors. I mean,
so it's like bleeding from the ears as we talk.
I mean, do you ever pay back your
That's lovely. I love it.
Yeah.
See, this is a funny
thing.
thing.
Can you talk about advances actually for the audience?
Do you want to hear about advances?
Just
Not
a little
really.
summary.
That's like, how much do you earn? That's actually, and that's what people do with authors, though, because it is quite the funny thing about being an author, and this is like, it's really hard. And this is why the Stella's so wonderful, I think, because it is really, really hard to be a writer and to keep doing it because you have all the psychic pain of doing it. But it's an industry that is incredibly exploitative. It is incredible. It degrades writers constantly. Like, it really is. It's a sort of industry where you go to writers' festivals, you get paid shit, you work so hard, you have all this expertise, and you're meant to be happy with, you know, like they have a drinks night where you kind of say too much when you should.
Booksellers are not.
No.
No.
But it's like, it's this whole sort of, it's a really, I think, you know, the arts, it's not just writing, but as a writer, I can speak from my experience. It's really hard being in the arts. And I think for creatives and people who support creatives, it's ridiculous. Like, it's ridiculous. It's so hard and it's so underfunded and it's so underappreciated. And you go into other industries and, you know, friends of mine, you know, adjacent sort of professions, you're like, wow, like, you know, the way that the understanding of what labour is worth and how it's paid. And so I think I think this is a bigger issue. It's not just literature, it's about creatives. So but I do have a question for you, Fiona, which I was just thinking as everyone's talking, is one thing that struck me as a really good thing about the Stella, but must be really hard, and you're quite new now, like you've come on board, but like we were saying, when we started, I think we had a very clear idea of what we wanted to do, and we expanded, and it did feel very unwieldy, but there was so much goodwill and there was so many people who were just fabulous in helping out, and it just grew and grew. But the landscape has changed tremendously. Our understanding of, you know, what we value in literature and who we value and who we lift up has changed a lot. How do you keep that focus? Because this is one thing I've watched the Stella evolve over the years, and it's like, where do you stop, and how do you keep that focus? I mean, you must have been thinking a lot about that in the last 6 months.
Well, that's all I talk about to myself.
Yeah.
I have this thing where I have ideas, and those ideas are often red balloons, bear with me, and I throw them up into the roof. You know, and they're all kind of like, I call them bad ideas in a way, because they're just isolated and they don't connect to anything. And then what happens at some point, there's this sort of mass of these red balloons up in my brain that are dancing around all these different wonderful ideas. And I wait till they collide, and then they drop. And then that possibly is then the seed of an idea for this arts organisation. So I've worked in other arts organisations before. So it's the same sort of structure, but I'm actually now in literature rather than in visual arts. So it's quite interesting for me. So what I do as part of my job, because I haven't come from the literature world, I've come from, I suppose let's say, arts and arts management, is I spend most of my last 5 months researching, like, what have you done? How have you done it? What is successful? Where are the remnants of it? Why did it not continue if it was successful? Why did we do it if it wasn't successful? Why didn't we road test it? All those sorts of things are the sorts of things that I've been exploring. And there are some incredibly great ideas that have been, and I've spoken to Christine over coffee about, there's some really good ones that I've seen that didn't continue, and I've then sought advice from people who've worked within Stella or from other literature fields to say, why is it? And often it might be, as Christine told me a few times, there are many people now in that field doing that work. We possibly don't need to do that and replicate it. For example, you know, if it's looking at, what was I looking at that point? I was looking at consent in literature within the education. So, you know, we discovered that there was so many other orgs that were talking about consent, not just in sport, but in literature. So not necessary for Stella to do it. So that's what we've been doing. And this is the first, you know, thing that I've actually developed that I've sort of rolled out because I saw it as a bridge between Stella, the Stella Prize, promoting women and non-binary writers, and the other public sphere, which is the Writers' Festival. So I went to 7 Writers' Festivals in 3 months. It's quite a lot. And I had a fantastic time, and I can tell you which were my favourites. Canberra was one of my favourites, interestingly, even though geographically very difficult to get around, but a great festival. So
I'm like, Adelaide.
Oh, well, we're just secretly, confidentially, just between you and the video. The long list is going to be announced at the Adelaide Writers' Festival this March. That's
Let's
exciting.
go up.
Hooray.
Let's go up to it.
Yeah, I want to go.
Come,
Yeah, let's
come,
go.
come.
So coming back to the
Sorry.
question, I think we'll evolve over time, and that's also why we wanted to have you in this talk, because we wanted to bring back the legacy, the knowledge, the heritage, but more importantly, the knowledge really of why this was needed, why Stella was needed. But yeah, I think the same reasons apply. I think that the world that we live in is still not fully accepting that women and non-binary are 52% of the population, and yet we have very little say in what we can and can't do, and that's very annoying, to say the least. I could be more
Getting a bit
aggressive.
tired of it now, aren't we?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that role of Stella continues, and I think that could possibly grow. So in terms of, being more involved in the new Creative Australia and starting to look at policy, I don't know how much policy's been done. I don't see a lot that we didn't really step into government policy where we could advise. And I think that's an area that would be very interesting. It wouldn't necessarily be me doing the advising, but under the umbrella of Stella, we could start getting some experts to talk to people who are influencers and who are the funders. I mean, let's face it, you go to apply for funding from any of the states or federal governments for literature, and they say we've got 3 opportunities for $3,000 each.
Yeah.
And coming from the visual arts where, we would get $60,000 to $120,000 for a project.
And some of that stuff your 3-year-old could do.
What did you say?
Joking.
She was bagging visual arts
No, I wasn't really.
in a hilarious,
Just
tongue-in-cheek way.
Yeah. No. Of course, I was being ridiculous. The visual arts is wonderful. Some of my best friends are visual artists. But one thing though, Fiona, as you're talking though, and it really
My best friends are women. Sorry.
It really strikes me that, I think the core of why the Stella worked was, this is a cliche, but it's true, it's the people that we were all really dynamic and engaged. We hit a moment, but everyone that we reached out to, some turned away, but there was this tremendous goodwill. And I remember a lot of emails that we were sending to, famous people and all that. Some of them came back going 3 cheers, but no, but they were still okay with it. But then we'd get all these people, and it was like it just grew and grew. And you can see that an organisation like the Stella is ultimately as good as its people, because that evolution and that, vision is only ever going to work if there's a lot of hands on deck and everyone is as passionate. And it's, I think as a broader kind of study of how things get done, I think that's how it just, because my memories of the early Stella were, us, and there were quite a few of us, and then we all just reached out to our networks, and then we all just had these things. And Joe and I were talking about when we pulled out, like it got to a point where, I thought, I'm not a meeting person. I'm not there was like accountants and all the legal stuff, and it would be like, but there were all these people who were doing it, and they were doing it passionately, and it's like, wow.
It also got to the point where there were so many great people involved in doing things that it felt like you could step back and you weren't letting people down to be stepping back.
There was just, and
it really was a relay. It felt like
into it. When we were,
but all this expertise that was needed, and that started coming on board, and it's like, wow, that's So it's the
Monica,
people.
was it you and I that went to one of the big banks first? So sure, within the first couple of weeks or so, we're like,
you went to Westpac,
There was a bank thing,
and we'll just go and ask them
yeah.
for the money, and they'll be really happy to give it to us.
Can we have $50,000?
$50,000, please.
And then you got arrested.
And we were like, here's some statistics.
No, we asked because the Stella. Remember the Stella beer?
Oh God, yeah.
Yeah.
Or did we discuss that and then decide we shouldn't because alcohol and?
Yeah, there was
I think
something,
that
but we were like, no, you weren't.
No, she was being silly.
But you know what?
I
there
found
was,
a big
though,
proposal we wrote for Vodafone that we were feeling but we were feeling good about it because the logic was that the Women's Prize in the UK had been called the Orange Prize because it was sponsored by Orange Broadband. So we had this big proposal for Vodafone based on that. We had but but what actually really is quite lovely that what ended up being what funds the prize is people in the community. It's like it's actually wonderful that it came through donors rather than
Actually,
corporates.
those donors are the same donors.
Yeah.
Years later, which I was really impressed.
Yeah.
And when I spoke to them, and I met with most of the top 30 or 40, and I'd say, what do you like?
Yeah.
And what would you like to change? And of course,
Yeah.
what would you like to change is always a euphemism for what's the problem.
Yeah.
And there was very little that they wanted to change. They just
that's
wanted to see
great.
more.
That's
They
great.
just wanted to see more. And so I think
Also,
having worked in many arts organisations, and you get a change over every 2 or 3 years where a donor who's donated is disappointed with an artist that you've exhibited, or there's some sort of issue that you might find that causes a donor to decide to move on to something else, and that's their absolute right. I found it really refreshing that the kind of support and authors and booksellers and publishers. I mean, it's quite incredible that what you started as a seed idea in a bar, with anger, as you say, with lots of anger, has actually become quite in a good way, an institution.
I should actually say anger. That's true. It did start from anger, but I guess, and Monica has said this, and Joe has said this in their different ways, but it also started in friendship too. We were all friends already. We all had each other's backs already. So you could be angry in that kind of environment, and no one was taking it personally. It really was that collective. And it worked because we all liked each other.
So you want to spend huge amounts of time with each other and sending lots of emails.
So nice.
Yeah.
There was no one to dislike
Yeah.
at all. It was really, and we had parties.
Well, we did. We had that launch party at Melbourne Writers Festival. That was, it was wonderful. It was like, and we did have that, also looking back over the minutes, it was really interesting to see how many events we did. So many events right from the beginning, just like, you're doing now. There, I think the next International Women's Day, a year after, while we were still getting the prize up and running, we had coordinated events all over Australia at bookshops and libraries, and I think
She's not happy with that answer, but I do like
with you on that, Karen.
But I do like your idea of broadening maybe by number the number of judges. But we have 245 books this year.
Fantastic.
And they need to read them all within a 5-month period. It's a lot of books.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah, no, probably got one more question.
There's 3. I can see there was 1, 2, 3,
I think this
4.
person with the glasses was first.
Okay, and then maybe end on Astrid.
Where's Astrid? Astrid. Astrid.
I just wonder, given that you're talking about things changing, what the panel's comment would be that there were, for the Booker shortlist, there were more men named Paul than there were in the 6, 5.
That's great.
Yeah, well, we're only accepting Monica and Joe.
Was that in an article, or was that just something you observed?
I observed.
And it was in a couple of articles too, because it's a great observation. Yeah.
So call your children Paul.
Astrid.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Carrie, I was a judge of the Stella Prize last year, so I feel like I should probably say something.
Oh, good.
If you think about the other national prizes, the Miles, the Prime Minister's Literary Awards, they're like black boxes, and they've been criticised really badly in terms of how they're judged, how the judges are selected, all sorts of things. So while I do think that things can be done differently in the Stella actually owns this space. It is the most respectable, hardest one. It's and having put my name to it because it is beautiful. What goes on behind the scenes. I think, so going back to kind of what could change or what could be added to, I think Stella could lead the national discussion in how you make judging more transparent and more fair.
Sorry.
Yeah, just thought I'd share that.
Oh no, it wasn't me.
It's great point.
Yeah, Karen was the chair. Yeah.
I just wanted to mention that I was longlisted the first year of the Stella Prize.
Amy.
And the impact that it made on my career just being longlisted, I know that it brought my book to the attention to other long lists and short lists, both here and internationally, and wondering whether or not you've done any research on how it brought the work of women writers to the attention both in Australia and around the world.
We haven't done that research, but I am very interested in the idea that if Australia can bring international authors to writers' festivals as a given, like, you know, the top, 10 in each festival, at least there's 6 to 10 internationals, and that's the same with all arts in Australia. We tend to have that tall poppy, bring them out, bring out a ticket. Why are we not doing more of that abroad?
And how thankful I was to Stella, but also to meet other writers, in the category, and how wonderful it was to be part of that community.
Congratulations.
Yeah, it was a beautiful book. Amy, actually, I actually was the publisher of a book that was shortlisted for the Stella this year, Bad Art Mother. And I have to say, what you just said, Amy, just made me think. I know that made a massive difference to that book, like such a difference. And thank you so much, Astrid and other judges, for that was a book that the author Edwina Preston had. Like, we were a tiny publisher, Wakefield Press, and that book had been rejected 25 times. And, it just made such a difference to sales of the book, I saw, but also to Edwina, like such a difference to have that book recognised. And I think you're right that the Stella, like, it was a different long list and short list from a lot of the other literary prizes, and I feel like it did pay more attention to different kinds of books and to independent publishers, and to not. It felt like it was. A lot of prizes feel like, or a lot of shortlists feel like there's a part of their thinking is that they're looking for what they might expect to be on there as well. And this really felt like you weren't thinking about that at all, or just taking the books for what they were, and it was fantastic. Sorry.
And just to add to that,
Yeah.
as a newbie, and watching Edwina this year going to various festivals and talking, and I'm sure you've got, you can probably agree as an author, the skill that she developed going to festivals, learning how to talk in front of audiences, speaking to the media is another benefit of the Stella Prize, which I think often gets ignored, which is that you can actually develop your skills not as a celebrity, but as someone who is confident enough to sell yourself as well, rather than being the writer in the garret writing a book. And I thought Edwina, watching her, because I went to 7 festivals that she was, and I did watch, and the final one, she was a powerhouse. I mean, she had her conversation down pat. She knew what she wanted to say. When someone threw her a curly question, she just knew how to answer it.
Yeah.
She was really positive. She understood how to work with the media as well, and I thought that was really quite incredible.
Yeah.
Really incredible.
Yeah.
Beautiful. It's kind of teary to watch her grow in that period. And I think that's the other benefit of being in the long list. And I think talking about that long list, sometimes what happens is that we celebrate the winner. And Stella, I think, is guilty of that as well, and that becomes the focus. And my aim this year, Astrid, and I don't know if it's going to work or not, is to really spend a lot more time with those long listers, because if you think about the fact that there's 260 books and those 12 were chosen out of 260, that's like 5%, less than 5%. These are winning books. They have already won. So the idea that each year we can support those 12, and then, because I've got to wrap up, don't I? And then that we can support, looking back in time through Stella Day, out of all the winning authors, and there's 132 so far.
Wow.
And there'll be 144 by next year. We can start actually, putting them on tour, sending them overseas, examining all sorts of things that they might need.
Amazing.
But with that, I need to
travel with them.
thank the girls who are going to have to stop talking. Thank you, Monica, Joe, and Christine.
Thank you, Fiona.
Thank you, Fiona. And everyone.
Thank you so much for sharing your conversations with me. And And also for me, it's an introduction as well. I met Christine because I contacted her, but I haven't met these two. So I feel like now I'm starting to understand the heritage. All of you have got bags on the back of your chairs. Please take them home. If you want more than one, as you can see, we've got a few. Coffee and tea, free coffee, tea and biscuits. We've got Monica and Joe's books in the foyer in the readings stand. So if you'd like to purchase one, I'm sure they'd like to write a special note in the front for you. And most importantly, Gabby keeps reminding me, and I keep forgetting to ask everyone, could you please fill in the surveys, because we do want to know what you think, because this is our first, and we're moving to Hobart in February, and then we're moving to Darwin, Brisbane and Sydney. So we want to make sure that we're on mark when it comes to what we need to do to make sure this experience is really fabulous for our audiences. Thank you so much.